There is a price for everything in this world, a weight measured in coin or blood or shame. Some souls are valued so highly they are kept in gilded cages, adorned with jewels to reflect their worth. Others are deemed worthless, cast aside like river stones, their only value in being forgotten. But value is a thing of perception, a story told by the buyer, not the seller. A river stone, to the right eye, can hold the memory of the current, the coolness of the deep, a perfect, smooth promise of stillness. A flaw, to the right eye, is not a break in perfection, but the very mark that makes a thing unique, the signature of its creation. If you're already hooked by Alara's story, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think her mark truly represents. Ilara had been told her flaw was a curse, a spiderweb of violet and silver ink spilled across her skin, from her left temple down her cheek to the column of her throat. A cartographer's mistake. A brand of misfortune. To her family, it was a mark of shame that made her worthless, and so they had brought her to the one place where even the worthless might fetch a price, the great hall of Viridia, where flesh was traded like livestock. She stood on the cold, circular dais, the chill of the marble seeping through the thin soles of her slippers, 1,000 pairs of eyes crawling over her like insects. The auctioneer's voice was a drone, a meaningless hum beneath the roar of her own blood in her ears. He spoke of her breeding, her temperament, her supposed purity, but his words were hollow, negated by the gasp that rippled through the crowd when the hood of her cloak was finally drawn back. The light from the crystal chandeliers caught the silver tracery of her mark, and it seemed to shimmer, to move, like a living constellation trapped beneath her skin. Whispers followed, sharp and cruel as scattered glass. Cursed. Stained. Look at it. It's unnatural. She kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the marble floor, a tiny fissure that mirrored the one splintering through her soul. This was the culmination of her life, to be judged and found wanting, to be sold for scraps to some lecherous old baron who would hide her away in a back room. Her father, standing near the dais with her brother, refused to meet her gaze. Their shame was a palpable thing, a hot, suffocating cloak she had been forced to wear since birth. I am nothing. A blemish. A debt to be settled. The thought was not new. It was the bedrock of her existence. The bidding began, and the price was an insult. A paltry sum, barely enough to cover the cost of a decent horse. Laughter echoed in the cavernous hall. Alara's hands, bound loosely before her with a silken cord, trembled. Humiliation was a physical pain, a tightening in her chest that stole her breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the floor would swallow her, that she could dissolve into nothing but memory and dust. Can you imagine being sold for less than a horse? Comment below if you think Alara's family deserves what's coming to them. Then, a sudden profound silence fell over the hall. It was so absolute, so heavy, that Alara thought for a moment she had gone deaf. The auctioneer's droning voice choked off mid-word. The rustle of silks and the clinking of goblets ceased. There was only the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. She dared to lift her head, her gaze sweeping over the sea of frozen faces. They were all staring, not at her, but at the grand archway at the back of the hall. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadows, a silhouette of immense size and power. He moved, stepping into the light, and a collective gasp, this one of terror and awe, replaced the silence. It was the Alpha King, King Theron of the Silverwood, the northern kingdom shrouded in mist and legend. No one from the north ever came this far south, least of all their king, a figure spoken of in hushed, fearful whispers. He was said to be ancient, ruthless, a being of primal power who ruled a court of shadows and beasts. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a starless night, and eyes that seemed to hold the cold fire of distant galaxies. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his formidable size, his presence sucking all the air and warmth from the room. His gaze swept over the auctioneer, the cowering nobles, and then it landed on her. It was not a glance. It was a physical impact, a spear of ice and fire that pinned her to the spot. He saw her. He did not look at her flaw, her mark, with disgust or pity. His eyes, a startling pale silver, traced the intricate pattern on her skin as if he were reading a sacred text. There was an intensity in his stare, a raw, possessive focus that made her skin prickle and her breath catch. If you're feeling the intensity right now, smash that like button and comment your first reaction when the Alpha King appeared. The auctioneer, finally finding his voice, stammered, "Your Majesty, we are honored. We did not expect." Theron raised a single, leather-gloved hand, and the man's words died in his throat. The king's voice, when it came, was a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the marble floor. "The price." He did not ask. He commanded. The auctioneer squeaked the pathetic current bid. A muscle feathered in the king's jaw. His eyes never left Alara. 1,000,000 gold sovereigns. The number dropped into the stunned silence like a meteor. It was an impossible sum, more than the treasuries of half the kingdoms represented in this hall. It was the price of a fleet of warships, of a decade of peace, of a queen's dowry. And he had offered it for her. For the stained, the cursed, the worthless girl. Murmurs erupted, a tidal wave of disbelief and confusion. Her father's face was a mask of shock, his mouth agape. The king's gaze remained locked on Alara, unwavering, unblinking. It was as if no one else in the room existed. The auctioneer, pale and sweating, looked around helplessly. Going once? No one dared to speak, to breathe. Going twice? The silence was a crushing weight. King Theron took another step forward, his power rolling off him in palpable waves. "There will not be a third call," he said, his voice soft, but laced with the promise of utter annihilation. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Sold! To the Alpha King of the North!" 1,000,000 gold? Like this video if you think the Alpha King just made the best investment of his life. The words sealed her fate. She was no longer Alara of House Valerius, the forgotten daughter. She was a possession, bought and paid for with a king's fortune. And as two of his guards, silent figures in dark silver-etched armor, moved toward the dais, she met the Alpha King's silver eyes once more. She saw no triumph in them, no lust, no pride of ownership. She saw something far more terrifying. She saw recognition, as if he had been searching for her and had, against all odds, finally found her. The silken cord at her wrists was cut by one of the guards, his movements efficient and impersonal. She was not touched, not handled, but simply freed. Yet she had never felt more captive. She was escorted from the dais, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind a maelstrom of fear and bewilderment. The crowd parted before them as if they were lepers, their faces a mixture of awe and morbid curiosity. She did not look at her family. She could feel their stares burning into her back, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her terror. As she was led toward the shadowed archway where the king waited, she felt the weight of his gaze settle upon her like a heavy velvet cloak. She was his. Whatever that meant, her life as the worthless, cursed girl was over. A new, terrifying chapter had begun, written in gold and sealed by the gaze of a predator king. She walked toward him, a ghost in a white dress, her cursed face the only color in a world that had suddenly gone gray. The cold marble beneath her feet was no colder than the dread icing her veins. He had paid everything for her. Now, she feared, she would have to learn the cost. The journey north was a blur of motion and silence. King Theron did not travel with the pomp and circumstance of a southern monarch. There was no grand carriage, no legion of courtiers. There was only a small retinue of his unnervingly quiet guards, a pack of massive, dark-furred wolves that padded alongside their horses with an intelligence in their eyes that was deeply unsettling, and the king himself. He rode a war horse as black as his own hair, a beast of breathtaking size and power that seemed carved from obsidian and shadow. Alara was given a gentle, gray mare, and she rode beside him, enveloped in a bubble of silence so profound it felt like its own kingdom. He did not speak to her. Not once since they had left the auction hall. He had simply motioned for her to mount, his gesture economical and precise. Yet, his awareness of her was absolute. She felt it in the way he angled his body slightly toward hers, a subtle shield against the wind. She felt it when her mare stumbled on a loose rock, and his hand shot out, not to touch her, but hovering an inch from her arm, ready to steady her, his reflexes impossibly fast. The first night they made camp in a dense ancient forest. The air grew cold, and Ilara, still in her thin auction dress, shivered. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve what little warmth she had. She watched him from across the fire. He moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency, his guards mirroring his every action without a single word being exchanged. They were a pack, a single organism moving in perfect accord. He looked up, his silver eyes finding hers in the flickering firelight. For a long moment he just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he rose, retrieved a heavy cloak from his saddle roll, and walked over to her. It was made of the softest, thickest fur she had ever felt, dyed a deep midnight blue and clasped with a heavy silver pin shaped like a snarling wolf's head. He did not ask for permission. He simply draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was instantaneous, a shock to her chilled skin. It smelled of him, of pine and cold mountain air and something else, something wild and clean and uniquely his. Her fingers curled into the fur, and she looked up at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes lingering on her face, on the mark that was so often a source of revulsion. He looked at it as if it were merely a part of her, no different from the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. Then he turned and walked back to the fire, leaving her cocooned in his scent and his warmth, more confused than ever. He paid a fortune for me, but he does not speak to me. He is a king, but he camps like a soldier. He looks at my curse, and he does not flinch. Her mind replayed the scene at the auction, the weight of his bid, the shock on every face. 1,000,000 sovereigns. Why? The question was a constant throbbing ache behind her eyes. Was she some political pawn? Did her disgraced family hold some secret he needed? But that made no sense. Her family was minor, their influence negligible. Was it the mark? Did he see some strange beauty in the disfigurement that others found so repellent? The thought was so foreign, so contrary to everything she had ever been taught, that she dismissed it almost immediately. No one saw beauty in a curse. Days bled into one another. They traveled hard and fast, the landscape slowly changing from the lush, rolling hills of the south to the jagged, pine-choked mountains of the north. A perpetual mist began to cling to the air, growing thicker with each passing day, until it felt as if they were moving through a world made of ghosts and shadows. The Silverwood. Even its name was a whisper. Alara learned to live in the silence, to read the unspoken language of the king and his guard. She saw the way their eyes were always scanning the trees, the way they moved as one to form a protective circle around her whenever they stopped. She was not a prisoner, not in the traditional sense. She was not bound or locked away, but she was guarded with a fierce, unrelenting vigilance that spoke of her immense value. She was precious cargo, a treasure to be protected. The thought sent another shiver through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. One evening, as dusk bled purple and orange through the misty canopy, one of the great wolves that traveled with them trotted over to her. It was larger than the others, its fur the color of smoke, its eyes a startling, intelligent amber. It stopped a few feet away, watching her with an unnerving stillness. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. The beasts were always near, but they had never approached her directly. It is going to attack me. They will watch it happen. But it did not snarl or crouch. It simply sat, its head cocked as if in curiosity. Slowly, tentatively, it crept forward and laid its massive head on her knee. Its fur was thick and coarse beneath her trembling hand. She could feel the power thrumming through its body, the heat of its life. She looked over at the king, who was watching the exchange, his face impassive. He gave another one of his infinitesimal nods, a silent permission. Hesitantly, Alara stroked the wolf's head. Its ears twitched, and a low rumble, like distant thunder, vibrated in its chest. It was not a growl of aggression. It was a purr. A wave of something warm and unfamiliar washed over her. For her entire life, she had been an object of fear and disgust. Animals shied away from her. Children pointed, adults whispered. But this creature, this powerful wild beast, sought her touch, offered its trust without reservation. She buried her fingers in its ruff, a single hot tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The wolf nudged her hand, demanding more. A small, watery smile touched her lips. It was the first time she had smiled in a very long time. Across the fire, Theron watched, and for the first time, Alara thought she saw something flicker in his silver eyes, a crack in the granite facade. It was a deep, profound ache, a loneliness that mirrored her own so perfectly it stole her breath. In that moment, she understood. He was not just a king, he was an outcast too. His kingdom was one of legends and fear, a place separated from the rest of the world. He was as isolated as she was, but his cage was a throne, and his walls were an entire kingdom. The thought was a revelation, a tiny seed of understanding planted in the barren soil of her fear. He was not her jailer, he was her counterpart. As they drew closer to the heart of his kingdom, the mist grew so thick it swallowed the world. The air became charged, with a strange energy, a hum that vibrated deep in her bones. The trees grew larger, their branches like the grasping arms of ancient gods. This was a land of magic, old and powerful. And she was being brought to its very heart, by the king who ruled it all. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of two lonely souls traveling toward an unknown fate. She was his property, yes, but she was beginning to suspect that the chain that bound her to him was not forged of gold, but of something far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. The mist parted as if by command, revealing the fortress of Silverwood. It was not a castle of elegant spires and sun-drenched courtyards like those in the south. It was a creature of stone and shadow, a citadel carved from the very heart of a black mountain, its towers scraping a sky permanently veiled in gray clouds. Waterfalls of mist cascaded down its sheer cliffs, and the only light came from glowing silver crystals embedded in the rock, pulsing with a soft, ethereal luminescence. It was beautiful, but it was a severe, intimidating beauty, the beauty of a drawn sword or a wolf's snarl. Who else would follow the Alpha King into his dark fortress? Comment: take me to Silverwood, if you're invested. As they passed through the colossal gates, wrought from a dark, star-flecked metal she didn't recognize, the silence that had been her companion on the road was shattered. The courtyard was filled with people, the inhabitants of this shadow court. They were tall and formidable, like their king, with the same preternatural grace and watchful eyes. They did not cheer or bow low. They stood in silent, unnerving ranks, their gazes fixed on her face. Alara felt the fur cloak, Theron's cloak, suddenly feel too thin. The whispers started again, a sibilant hiss that slithered through the misty air. They were not the cruel, mocking whispers of the auction hall. These were different. Fearful. Suspicious. The mark. Is it her? The outsider. Why would he bring her here? She felt 100 pairs of silver-gray eyes dissecting her, judging her, and the familiar, sickening feeling of being an object on display washed over her. Her hands trembled, and she instinctively pulled the collar of the cloak higher, a futile attempt to hide. Theron dismounted in one fluid motion. The entire courtyard held its breath, waiting. He walked to her side and looked up at her, his expression unyielding. He did not offer a hand to help her down. He simply waited, his presence a silent command and, strangely, a challenge. Show them you are not afraid. She did not know where the thought came from, but it resonated within her. He had not treated her as a fragile, broken thing. He had shown her a quiet, demanding respect. Taking a shaky breath, Alara swung her leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. Her knees nearly buckled when her feet touched the stone, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet the hostile stares with a placid expression she did not feel. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. Theron's eyes held hers for a fraction of a second, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been approval. He turned to face his court, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. She is Alara. She is under my protection. She will be treated as my guest, with all the honor and respect that entails. Any who disobey will answer to me. The threat was unspoken but absolute. A ripple of unease went through the crowd. They bowed their heads, not in welcome, but in submission to his will. She was his, and his word was law. An older man with a severe face and hair the color of iron stepped forward. His eyes, a pale, cold gray, raked over Alara with open disapproval. "My king," he said, his voice gravelly. "Forgive my impertinence, but the prophecies spoke of a savior, not a stained outsider. The people are afraid. The blight worsens with every moon." Theron's gaze turned glacial. "Your counsel is noted, Valerius," he said, his tone dangerously soft. "And dismissed. Prepare chambers for her, the finest we have." Lord Valerius bowed stiffly, his jaw tight with resentment. He shot Alara one last withering look before turning to bark orders at the servants. The court dispersed, melting back into the shadows of the great fortress, leaving Alara feeling raw and exposed. She was an unwelcome guest in a hostile land, brought here by a king who protected her, but would not explain why. The chambers she was led to were indeed the finest. They were vast and opulent, carved from the same dark stone as the mountain, but softened with thick fur rugs, heavy velvet tapestries, and furniture made of polished silverwood. A fire roared in a massive hearth, and the air was warm and scented with cedar. But it was a gilded cage. The windows, tall arches of spun crystal, looked out not onto an open sky, but onto a sheer cliff face where the mist swirled in a constant, disorienting dance. She was at the heart of the fortress, buried deep within the mountain, safe and trapped. For days she saw no one but a young servant girl named Lyra, who brought her meals and attended to her needs with downcast eyes and trembling hands. Lyra was terrified of her, flinching whenever Alara's marked face was turned toward her. The isolation was a familiar ache, a cloak she had worn her whole life. Yet, it was different here. In her old home, she was ignored because she was worthless. Here, she was isolated because she was important. A source of fear and speculation. Theron did not visit her. She would catch glimpses of him in the hallways, a fleeting shadow of power and purpose, but he never sought her out. The loneliness began to fester, breeding a bitter resentment. He had ripped her from her life, paid a fortune for her, and then abandoned her in this luxurious prison. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her rooms any longer, she slipped out. The castle was a labyrinth of echoing stone and silver light, quiet and empty. She wandered aimlessly, her hand trailing along the cold walls until she heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding. Following it, she found herself on a high balcony overlooking a vast torchlit training yard. Below, Theron was training. He was stripped to the waist, his skin gleaming with sweat in the firelight. The powerful muscles of his back and shoulders rippled as he moved, wielding a massive greatsword as if it were a willow branch. He was not just practicing forms, he was fighting an unseen enemy, his movements a blur of deadly grace, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly alone. He fought with a desperation, a ferocity that spoke of a deep, internal war. Alara watched, mesmerized, hidden in the shadows. This was the king behind the throne, the man beneath the crown. A warrior burdened by a weight she could not comprehend. As she watched, he faltered, his sword tip dipping to the ground. He leaned on it, his chest heaving, his head bowed. A sound escaped him, a low groan of pain and exhaustion that was so full of despair it pierced her heart. It was the sound of a man carrying the world on his shoulders and feeling it begin to crumble. In that moment, her resentment dissolved, replaced by a wave of unexpected, overwhelming empathy. She did not see the Alpha King. She saw a man in agony. He had bought her, yes, but perhaps he had not bought a possession. Perhaps he had bought a sliver of hope, a desperate last-ditch gamble against the encroaching darkness she had heard Valerius call the Blight. She was a piece in a game she did not understand, but she was beginning to see that the stakes were far higher than her own fate. They were the fate of a king, and his entire kingdom. She slipped back to her rooms before he could see her, her mind reeling. The gilded cage was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary, a place where she was being kept safe. But from what? And for what? The questions multiplied, but now they were laced not with fear, but with a dawning, terrifying sense of purpose. A week passed in quiet solitude. Alara began to explore her gilded cage, finding a small, forgotten library filled with ancient texts and a hidden alcove with a window that, on the rare days the mist thinned, offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. She found a strange sort of peace in the quiet, a respite from the judging eyes she had endured her entire life. Here, at least, her isolation was absolute, not a public spectacle. The young servant, Lyra, slowly began to lose her fear. Alara would speak to her gently, asking about her family, about the castle. Lyra's answers were always clipped and fearful, her eyes darting toward Alara's marked skin, but she no longer flinched at every word. It was a start. One afternoon, while reading in the library, Alara found a book bound in worn, silver-stamped leather. It was a history of the Lycan kings, the royal line of Silverwood. She ran her fingers over the embossed crest, the same snarling wolf's head as the clasp on Theron's cloak. Hesitantly, she opened it. The pages were filled with tales of incredible strength, of kings who could run with the wolves, of a deep magical connection to their land. And then she found the chapter on the curse. It was called the Ashen Blight, an ancient malediction laid upon their line centuries ago by a spurned fey sorceress. It was a slow decay, a creeping sickness that leached the life from the land and the people. It weakened their regenerative abilities, dimmed their senses, and slowly, inexorably, turned their vibrant life force to dust. Each generation grew weaker than the last. Theron, the book said, was the last of his direct line. The full weight of the curse had fallen upon him. He is dying, she thought, a cold dread seeping into her bones. They are all dying. The book spoke of a prophecy, a sliver of hope. It foretold the coming of a moon-marked queen, an outsider who would carry the key to breaking the curse in her very skin. The prophecy described a constellation of silver and violet, a map of salvation drawn by the hand of fate. Ilara's hand flew to her cheek, her fingers tracing the swirling pattern of her birthmark. A constellation. A map. The air left her lungs in a rush. This was why. This was why he had paid a king's ransom. He hadn't bought a mate or a political pawn. He had bought a prophecy. He had bought a cure. The thought was staggering, terrifying. He had looked at her, and where everyone else saw a curse, he had seen a savior. She was not a person to him. She was a tool, a key to unlock his people's salvation. The empathy she had felt for him curdled into a new, more complex emotion. A sharp, bitter disappointment. He doesn't see me. He sees a prophecy. The prophecy is revealed. Drop a like if you love a good fate-bound romance, and comment what you think will happen next. That evening, there was a knock on her door. Not the timid tap of Lyra, but a solid, authoritative rap. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. She opened it to find Theron standing there. It was the first time he had come to her chambers. He filled the doorway, his presence immense. He held a small silver tray, and on it was a single perfect white flower, its petals glowing with a soft internal light. A moonbloom. She had read about them. They grew only in the most magically potent parts of the silverwood, and were said to have healing properties. "This is for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped inside, placing the tray on a small table. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Why am I here?" Ilara asked, her voice stronger than she expected. She would not be a passive key, a silent tool. She needed to hear it from him. Theron turned to face her, his silver eyes searching her face. "You know why," wasn't a question. "I am a prophecy to you," she said, the words tasting like ash, "a means to an end." A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his features. "When I first saw you on that dais," he began, his voice softer now, more intimate, "I did not see a prophecy. I saw the other half of my own soul. I saw the pattern the stars made the night I was born, etched onto your skin." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense, it felt as if he were looking straight into her. "The prophecy is just words on a page, Ilara, a hope we clung to in the darkness. You are the hope made real." His honesty was a disarming blow. He reached out, his gloved fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently, reverently, touched her cheek. His touch was not clinical or assessing. It was tender. It was a caress. He traced the largest swirl of her mark, from her temple to her jaw, his thumb brushing over her skin with an aching gentleness. No one had ever touched her mark with anything but revulsion. "For centuries, my people have been fading," he murmured, his eyes full of a pain so profound it made her own heart ache in sympathy. "This blight, it steals our light, our strength. It is a slow, agonizing death. I have watched my friends grow weak, my elders pass before their time. I carry the weight of their suffering, of their fading hope." He dropped his hand, balling it into a fist at his side. "I would have paid 1,000 fortunes for you. I would have burned the world to the ground to bring you here." The raw, desperate sincerity in his voice shattered her defenses. This was not the cold calculation of a king using a tool. This was the desperate plea of a man fighting for the survival of everything he loved. "I am his hope. His only hope." "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For now," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a sight so rare and beautiful it made her stomach flutter. I need you to live, to be safe. The source of the curse knows you are here. Its power grows, and it will try to stop you. He gestured to the moonbloom. This will help shield you. Its light repels the shadows. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. I am sorry for the silence, Alara. It was not my intent to make you feel like a prisoner. It was my fear. Fear of hoping too much. Fear of failing you. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the glowing flower and the echo of his confession. The walls of her room no longer felt like a cage. They felt like a sanctuary. And the man who had built them was not her captor, but a desperate, lonely king who looked at her and saw not a curse, not a prophecy, but hope itself. A terrifying, heavy burden. But for the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of her own hope ignite within her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was more than a blemish after all. The king's confession changed everything. The silence between them was replaced by a fragile, tentative connection. He began to visit her, not often, but with purpose. He would bring her books he thought she might enjoy, or strange, beautiful artifacts from the castle's vaults. He spoke of his kingdom, not of its politics or its wars, but of its soul. He told her of the deep bond between his people and the land, how they could feel the life force of the forest in their own veins, and how the ashen blight was slowly severing that connection, leaving them adrift and hollow. He never spoke of the prophecy again, but it was a constant, unspoken presence between them. Alara learned to see the effects of the blight firsthand. She saw the weariness in the eyes of the guards, the slight tremor in the hands of the elderly Lord Valerius, the way the vibrant, glowing crystals that lit the fortress sometimes flickered and dimmed, as if struggling to draw breath. The entire kingdom was holding its breath, waiting. Alara's fear for her own fate began to transform into a fierce, protective concern for these people, for this king who carried such an immense burden. One day he took her to the heart of the mountain, to a place called the Lycaeum. It was a vast cavern, the ceiling lost in darkness, the floor a network of glowing silver streams that converged on a central pool of shimmering, starlit water. This, he explained, was the source of their power, the nexus of their connection to the land. But the water was cloudy, the light of the streams weak and faltering. The blight poisons the source, he said, his voice heavy. He knelt by the pool, dipping his hand into the water. When he pulled it out, his skin had a faint grayish tinge that slowly faded. It's getting worse, faster than I anticipated. Alara knelt beside him, her reflection a wavering ghost next to his. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the water's surface. A strange impulse, a pull from deep within her, urged her to touch it. As her fingertips grazed the water, a ripple of pure, silver light exploded from the point of contact. The entire cavern flared with brilliant, clean light, and a collective gasp echoed from the guards stationed at the entrance. The murky water around her hand cleared, shimmering with a renewed intensity. Theron stared, his eyes wide with disbelief and awe. He looked from the glowing water to her face, to the mark on her skin which was now pulsing with a soft, violet luminescence. How? He breathed. I don't know, she whispered, pulling her hand back as if burned. The light receded, the water slowly clouding over again. But something had changed. A spark of life had been returned to the heart of the mountain, and it had come from her. The incident sent ripples through the court. The guards who had witnessed it spoke in hushed, awestruck tones. Lord Valerius's open hostility toward her softened into a grudging, bewildered respect. Even Lyra, the servant girl, began to meet her eyes, a flicker of hope dawning in her timid gaze. Alara was no longer just the king's strange purchase. She was a miracle in the flesh. The weight of their hope was suffocating. They looked to her for salvation, but she had no idea how she had done it, or if she could do it again. She felt like a fraud, a girl with a strange birthmark who had accidentally stumbled upon a trick of the light. Theron, however, saw it differently. That evening he came to her chambers, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. He did not speak, but walked to the window, staring out at the swirling mist. "My father, the king before me, fought the blight his entire life," he said quietly, his back to her. "He grew weaker and weaker, but he never gave up hope. On his deathbed, he told me that our salvation would not come from strength or from swords, but from a light the darkness could not comprehend." He turned to face her, his silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "He was talking about you." He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping directly in front of her. He reached up, his movements slow, deliberate, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm and calloused, a warrior's hands, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are not a tool, you are not a key. You are the dawn after a century of night." His gaze dropped to her lips, and the air crackled with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between them, the scent of pine and winter air, the warmth of his hands on her skin. "He is going to kiss me." The thought sent a jolt of panic and longing through her. She was the cursed girl, the stained one. She was unworthy of a king's touch, of any man's affection. But in his eyes, she saw none of that. She saw only reverence. She saw a reflection of herself that was not broken or flawed, but beautiful and whole. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her cheek. "I am bound to you, Ilara, not by prophecy, but by choice. My soul recognized yours the moment I saw you. Everything else is just noise." He did not kiss her. He pulled back, his hands dropping from her face, leaving her skin tingling. The moment of intimacy was broken, but the promise of it lingered in the air. He had given her a gift more precious than 1,000,000 sovereigns. He had shown her her own worth, reflected in the eyes of a king. Is anyone else getting major butterflies right now? Like if you're shipping Ilara and Theron hard. But as the hope in the castle grew, so did the shadows. The blight was a malevolent, sentient thing, and it had felt her touch at the Lycaeum. It now knew its enemy. Ilara began to have nightmares, visions of grasping, shadowy tendrils, and a woman's voice whispering venomous promises in her mind, telling her she was weak, worthless, that her power would fail, that she would be the death of them all. The darkness was closing in. It had a name, a face, and it was coming for her. The hope she had brought to Silverwood had just made her a target. The fight for their survival had just begun. The nightmares grew worse, seeping into her waking hours. She would see shadows move in the corners of her vision, hear whispers on the edge of hearing that vanished when she tried to focus on them. The malevolent presence that was the source of the ashen blight was testing her, probing her defenses, feeding on the insecurities that had been ingrained in her since birth. "You are an imposter, a flaw. You cannot save them. You will only lead them to ruin." The voice was insidious, a silken poison that coiled around her heart. She tried to hide her growing fear, but Theron saw it. He always saw. He found her one morning in the library, staring blankly at a page, her hands trembling. He said nothing, simply taking the book from her grasp, closing it, and taking her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. "Walk with me," he commanded softly. He led her not to the training grounds or the formal halls, but up a winding staircase to the very top of the highest tower. A heavy, iron-bound door opened onto the windswept roof. For the first time since arriving, Ilara was above the mist. The sky was a vast, clear expanse of pale blue, and the sun, a sight she had almost forgotten, cast a weak but welcome warmth on her face. Below them, the sea of mist stretched to the horizon, obscuring the world. They were on an island in the sky. "The Blight cannot reach this high," Theron said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "The air is too clean here." He led her to the edge, where a low stone parapet was the only thing between them and an endless fall. The wind whipped her hair across her face and billowed in her dress. It felt wild and freeing. "The sorceress who cursed my line was named Morwen," he said, his eyes fixed on the misty horizon. "She was Fae, powerful. She loved my ancestor, the first Lycan king, but his heart was already given to another, a wolf shifter like himself. In her rage and jealousy, she wove a curse not of quick death, but of slow decay. She wanted his bloodline, his entire legacy, to wither and turn to ash, just as her love had." He turned to her, his expression grim. "Her spirit is bound to the curse. It is her malice that you feel, her voice that you hear. She feeds on despair. The more hope you bring to my people, the more fiercely she will attack you, for hope is poison to her." Understanding dawned on Alara. She was not just fighting a curse, she was fighting the hateful, bitter ghost of a woman scorned centuries ago. "How do we fight her?" she asked. "We do not fight her with swords," Theron replied. "We fight her with the one thing she cannot comprehend. Unconditional love, acceptance. The prophecy says the curse will be broken when the moon-marked queen is accepted not as a savior, but as one of our own. When she is bound to the Alpha King not by duty, but by heart." His words hung in the air between them, a clear and unambiguous declaration. This was about more than a prophecy. This was about them, bound by heart. The phrase echoed in her mind, a terrifying and beautiful prospect. "She preys on your fear that you are unworthy," Theron continued, taking a step closer. "She whispers the lies you were told your entire life. You must not believe her. Look at me, Alara." She lifted her gaze to his. His silver eyes were fierce, intense. "You are not a flaw. You are not a curse. Your mark is not a stain. It is a sign of your strength. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." His sincerity was absolute. He believed it with every fiber of his being. And as he spoke, she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a steady, defiant light pushing back against the encroaching shadows of Morwen's whispers. "He sees me." The phrase returned to her, no longer a question or a source of confusion, but a statement of fact. He saw her, all of her, and found her beautiful. The weight of that acceptance was a powerful shield. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her marked cheek. The simple, tender gesture was more intimate than any kiss. "I will not let her harm you," he vowed, his voice a low growl. "I will stand between you and any shadow that dares to reach for you." The conviction in his voice was a fortress. For the first time, Alara felt she was not alone in her fight. She had an ally, a protector, a king who would defy ancient curses for her. But even as his strength bolstered her, a new fear took root. If the key was their bond, then Morwen would not just target her anymore. She would target him. She would try to destroy their connection, to turn them against each other, to poison the very foundation of their hope. The thought was terrifying. The love he offered was a weapon against the darkness, but it was also a vulnerability. To accept it meant putting him in danger. To reject it meant surrendering to the blight. She looked at him, at the powerful, lonely king who had gambled everything on her, and she knew she had no choice. She could not let him fight alone. "Then we will face her together," she said, her voice clear and steady, carried on the wind. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. It was a sight that stole her breath. "Together," he agreed. He offered her his arm, a formal, courtly gesture that felt deeply personal. As she took it, her fingers brushing against the hard muscle beneath his tunic, she felt a current of energy pass between them, a spark of shared purpose. As they descended from the tower back into the mists of the castle, Alara felt different. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was overshadowed by a new, burgeoning strength. She was not just Alara, the stained girl. She was not just the moon-marked queen of a prophecy. She was Theron's partner in a war against darkness, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight. She would not be a victim of her past or a pawn of prophecy. She would be the queen this kingdom needed. The castle of Silverwood, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a home. Alara moved through it not as a guest, but as a future queen. She spent time with the people, listening to their stories, learning their customs. She visited the sick, laying her hands on their fevered brows. She could not cure them, not yet, but her touch seemed to soothe their pain, to bring a flicker of light back to their weary eyes. The people's awe of her slowly transformed into a quiet, fierce affection. They began to call her Alara of the Light. Her bond with Theron deepened with each passing day. They spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. He showed her the secret paths of the castle, the history etched into its very stones. She, in turn, told him of her lonely childhood, of the pain of being rejected by her own family. He listened with a quiet intensity, his anger on her behalf a palpable thing, a low growl in his chest. In these moments he was not a king, and she was not a prophecy. They were just a man and a woman. Two lonely souls who had found their counterpart in the most unlikely of circumstances. One evening, he took her to the royal armory. The vast hall was filled with weapons of every kind, their surfaces gleaming in the silver light. He led her to a glass case at the very center. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a circlet of woven silver, shaped like intertwined moonblooms, with a single flawless diamond at its center that seemed to drink the light. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice soft with memory. "The crown of the Lycan Queen. It is said that it will only shine for the true queen." He opened the case and lifted the circlet. It was delicate and beautiful, yet held an aura of ancient power. He turned to her, holding it in his hands. "It is yours, if you will have it." This was more than a gift. It was a proposal, a formal declaration of his intent. He was asking her to be his queen, his wife, his mate. Her heart hammered against her ribs. All her life she had dreamed of being wanted, of being loved. Now it was being offered to her, a love as vast and powerful as the king who held it. But the whispers of Morwen were still there, a faint venomous echo in her mind. "You are not worthy of a crown. You will only bring him death." She looked into Theron's eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, any sign that he saw her as the prophecy and not the woman. But there was none. There was only adoration, unwavering and absolute. "Yes," she whispered, the word a release of all her fear, all her doubt. "Yes." A radiant smile broke across his face. He gently placed the circlet on her head. The moment the silver touched her skin, the diamond at its center flared to life, casting a brilliant, pure white light that filled the entire armory, chasing away every shadow. A collective gasp came from the guards at the door. The crown had accepted her. Theron's hands cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "My queen," he breathed, his voice thick with reverence. He leaned down and finally, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, profound tenderness. It was a promise, a vow, a sealing of their souls. It was the taste of pine and winter and forever. In that moment, As the light of the crown bathed them both, Alara felt whole for the first time in her life. The broken pieces of her soul, shattered by years of rejection, were being knit back together by this man's unwavering love. Drop a like if this is the most romantic scene you've ever heard. Comment with a if you felt that connection. But their moment of joy was short-lived. A sudden bone-jarring tremor shook the entire mountain. The weapons in the armory rattled in their racks, and a deep groaning sound echoed from the stone around them. The light from the crown flickered violently. Theron pulled back, his body instantly tensing, his expression shifting from tender lover to warrior king. "She knows," he growled. "She felt the crown accept you. She is attacking the heart of the mountain." Alarms began to ring throughout the fortress, their clamor a frantic heartbeat. Guards were shouting, their voices laced with panic. Another tremor hit, stronger this time, and cracks spiderwebbed across the stone floor. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "The Lycaeum!" Theron yelled over the din. "She's trying to poison the source completely." He grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. "Stay with me." They ran from the armory, the castle around them groaning as if in its death throes. The glowing crystals that lit the halls were flickering and dying, plunging corridors into darkness. The air grew thick and cold, carrying a foul, cloying scent of decay and despair. It was the stench of the blight, stronger than ever before. People were screaming, their fear a tangible thing that Morwen's spirit could feed on. As they raced toward the heart of the mountain, shadowy tendrils, blacker than any natural darkness, began to seep from the walls, grasping for them. Theron moved with impossible speed, pulling Alara along, his greatsword now in his other hand, a blur of silver as he slashed through the spectral limbs. But they were endless, reforming as quickly as he could cut them down. They reached the entrance to the Lycaeum. The cavern, once a place of serene power, was now a maelstrom of shadow and corrupted energy. The central pool was no longer shimmering. It was a roiling pit of black, viscous liquid that pulsed with a malevolent green light. The silver streams that fed it had turned to sludge. At the center of the pool, a form was taking shape, coalescing from the darkness. A woman, tall and terrible, her face a mask of rage, her eyes burning with green fey fire. "Morwen, you will not have him!" The spirit shrieked, her voice a chorus of pain and hatred that echoed in Alara's mind. "This kingdom is mine to destroy. I will turn it to dust, and you, little flaw, will be the first to crumble." The shadowy tendrils surged toward them, no longer probing but striking with lethal force. Theron shoved Alara behind him, a bulwark of strength against the tide of darkness. "I cannot fight her spirit and protect the source at the same time," he yelled. Alara looked past him, at the dying heart of the mountain, at the screaming spirit of the sorceress. Fear, cold and absolute, tried to paralyze her. This was a battle between ancient magical beings. What could she, a girl with a birthmark, possibly do? But then she felt the warmth of the crown on her head, the memory of Theron's kiss on her lips, the weight of his love in her heart. She was not that girl anymore. She was a queen, his queen, and she would not let this ghost destroy their home. "You don't have to fight her alone," Alara said, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. She stepped out from behind Theron, her eyes fixed on the vengeful spirit. The crown on her head flared with light, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. "This is not your kingdom anymore, Morwen," she declared. "Your hate will find no home here." The battle for Silverwood had come. It would be won or lost not with swords, but with light against shadow, with love against hate. And Alara, the girl who had been sold for being worthless, was now standing at the very center of it all. Morwen's spectral form solidified, her eyes burning with an ancient, jealous rage. "You speak of love?" she hissed, her voice echoing with the pain of 1,000 years of solitude. What does a flawed, broken thing like you know of love? He desires your power, not your heart. He sees a cure, not a queen. The words were barbs, crafted from Ilara's deepest insecurities, designed to poison the bond between them. The shadowy tendrils lashed out, not at Theron this time, but at Ilara. Before Theron could move, Ilara stood her ground. She raised her hands, not in defense, but as if to welcome the assault. She focused on the feeling of Theron's love, on the memory of his reverent touch on her marked skin, on the brilliant light of the crown that had accepted her. She used it as a shield. As the shadows touched her, they did not tear or corrupt. They sizzled and dissolved into smoke, unable to find purchase on a soul so thoroughly illuminated by acceptance. Morwen shrieked in frustration. "Why do you not break?" "Because I am not broken," Ilara cried out, her voice resonating with newfound power. "My mark is not a flaw, it is a map, just as the prophecy said, and it has led me home." Theron watched, his heart swelling with a fierce protective pride. He saw her, not as a fragile girl he needed to shield, but as a queen in her full power, a warrior of the light. He turned his attention from her to the dying pool. He had to give her a fighting chance. Plunging his sword into the stone at the cavern's edge, he knelt, placing both palms flat against the ground. He closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself, past the creeping tendrils of the blight, to the core of his alpha power, the primal connection to his land. "My land, my people, hear me," he roared, not with his voice, but with his soul. "Lend me your strength, one last time." An answering tremor ran through the mountain, a deep, resonant hum of ancient life. The remaining glowing crystals in the fortress flared, pouring their fading energy toward the Lycaeum. Light, pure and silver, surged up Theron's arms, his veins glowing like molten rivers. The effort was agony. The blight fought him, tearing at his life force, but he held on, a conduit for the last vestiges of his kingdom's magic. He directed the energy not at Morwen, but into the poisoned pool, a desperate attempt to cleanse the source. The black water screamed as the silver light hit it, boiling and churning. Morwen cried out, her form flickering as the source of her power was contested. She turned her full fury on Theron. "Fool! You will burn yourself out from the inside!" Shadowy tendrils, now tipped with barbs of solidified despair, shot toward his kneeling, vulnerable form. "Theron!" Ilara screamed. She ran, placing herself between him and Morwen's attack. She knew what she had to do. The prophecy said the mark was the key. She had touched the water and brought it a spark of life. Now she had to immerse herself in it completely. It was a terrifying gamble. The pool was a vortex of dark and light magic, a battleground that could tear her soul apart. But looking at Theron, his face strained, sweat beading on his brow as he poured his very life into the mountain, she knew she would risk anything for him. She did not hesitate. Taking a deep breath, Ilara turned and leaped into the center of the roiling pool. The shock was absolute. It was like being plunged into both ice and fire at once. The corrupting magic of the blight latched onto her, trying to consume her, whispering every failure and fear she had ever known directly into her mind. Morwen's hateful presence was everywhere, trying to snuff out her spirit. But then, the mark on her skin ignited. It was not a soft glow this time, but a blazing, brilliant light, a constellation of pure silver and violet energy. The map. It connected with the silver light Theron was pouring into the pool, and with the ancient magic of the Lycaeum itself. Her body became a nexus, a living key turning in the lock of the curse. The pain was excruciating, a fire that burned through every nerve, but beneath it was a feeling of profound connection. She could feel the heartbeat of the mountain, the collective soul of the Lycan people, the unwavering strength of Theron's love. They were all pouring into her, through her. I am a part of this land. I am one of them. I am home. The realization was a final defiant roar against the darkness. The light exploded from her. A tidal wave of pure, cleansing energy erupted from the pool, a supernova of silver and violet. It slammed into Morwen's spectral form. The sorceress let out one last long wail of disbelief and fading rage. It cannot be. Love. It cannot. Her form dissolved, her hate-filled energy neutralized, her ancient curse finally, utterly broken. The wave of light washed through the cavern, then through the entire fortress, and out into the kingdom beyond. The black, sludgy streams of the Lyceum cleared, turning to shimmering, liquid starlight. The dying crystals in the halls blazed with a light brighter than ever before. The shadowy tendrils evaporated into nothingness. Outside the castle, the eternal mist that had shrouded the Silverwood for centuries began to part, torn asunder by the cleansing light. For the first time in generations, the sun shone down on the valleys of the north. The blight was gone. If you have chills right now, smash that like button. Comment. They broke the curse, if you're celebrating with them. In the now silent cavern, Theron, drained and exhausted, staggered to the edge of the pool. It was calm now, its water pristine and glowing. Ilara floated in the center, her body limp, the crown still on her head. The light from her mark had faded back to its normal, beautiful shimmer. "Ilara!" he cried, his voice raw with fear. He waded into the water, gathering her into his arms. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. For one heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. He pressed his forehead to hers, his heart shattering. "Don't leave me," he whispered, a broken prayer. "Please, I just found you." A soft cough answered him. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, the warm brown he had come to adore, found his. A weak smile touched her lips. "Did we win?" she whispered. Relief so profound it was painful washed over him. He crushed her to his chest, burying his face in her wet hair. "We won," he choked out. "You saved us. You saved us all." He lifted her from the pool, carrying her as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. As he stepped onto the stone floor, the assembled guards, their faces streaked with tears of joy, dropped to one knee. Lord Valerius was among them, his head bowed low, not in submission to his king, but in reverence for his queen. Ilara, cradled in Theron's arms, looked at the faces of the people she had saved, at the shining, healed heart of the mountain, and then up at the man who had seen her worth when no one else had. The curse was broken. Not by a prophecy, but by a choice. The choice to see a blemish as a beauty, to see a rejection as a homecoming, and to fight for a love that could hold back the darkness. She was home. The days that followed were like a dream. The sunlight, once a foreign concept in Silverwood, now streamed through the crystal windows, painting the stone halls in warm golden hues. The land itself seemed to sigh in relief, trees growing greener, the rivers running clearer. The Ashen Blight was nothing more than a dark memory. The people, their strength and vitality returning with astonishing speed, celebrated with a joy that was almost delirious. Laughter, a sound rarely heard in the grim fortress, now echoed in the courtyards. And at the center of it all was Ilara. She was no longer an object of suspicion or even of awe. She was theirs. She was the queen who had walked into the heart of their despair and brought back the sun. They adored her with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Her mark, once a source of shame, was now a celebrated symbol of their salvation. Mothers would gently touch their children's cheeks, whispering the tale of the moon-marked queen whose beauty had saved them all. Ilara found that the deepest healing came not from the grand victory, but from these small moments of acceptance. Sitting with the children in the gardens, their small hands tracing the patterns on her face with innocent curiosity. Sharing a meal with Lyra, who now chattered away like a happy magpie, her fear long forgotten. Receiving a stiff, formal bow of gratitude from Lord Valerius, his old eyes filled with a profound and sincere respect. Each interaction was a balm on the old wounds of her past, stitching them closed until only faint, silvery scars of memory remained. Her relationship with Theron blossomed in the newfound light. The burdens of the crown and the curse, which had forced him into a shell of grim duty, fell away. She discovered the man beneath the king, a man with a quiet, dry wit, a deep love for his people, and a tenderness that was reserved for her alone. He would bring her moonblooms from the newly thriving forest, not as a shield, but simply because he knew she loved their gentle light. They would spend hours on the high tower, no longer hiding from the mist, but watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors, his arm wrapped securely around her. He never stopped looking at her as if she were a miracle. One evening, a week after the battle, he led her back to the Lycaeum. The cavern was now a place of breathtaking beauty, the pool a perfect mirror reflecting 1,000 glittering stars on the cavern ceiling, the silver streams singing a soft, magical song. "The heart of the mountain is whole again, because of you," he said, his voice filled with reverence. He took her hand, leading her to the water's edge. The final part of the binding must be completed, not for the prophecy, but for us. He knelt before her, taking both of her hands in his. "Alara of the light, queen of the silverwood, light of my soul, I offered you a crown in the shadows. Now, in the light, I offer you my whole heart, my life, my everything. Will you be my wife, my mate, my forever?" Tears streamed down Alara's face, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. She thought of the girl on the auction block, the worthless, stained creature who believed herself unlovable. And she looked at the magnificent king kneeling before her, offering her a world she had never dreamed possible. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, "forever." He slid a simple, elegant ring of woven silver onto her finger. It warmed at her touch, a sign of the living magic within it. He rose and drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion and love that sealed their promise. A week later, the wedding took place. It was not a somber, formal affair, but a joyous celebration that involved the entire kingdom. Alara wore a gown of shimmering silver silk, and on her head, her mother-in-law's crown shone with a brilliant, happy light. Theron stood beside her, no longer just a king in black armor, but a man radiant with love, his silver eyes never leaving her face. They were married by the edge of the cleansed pool in the Lycaeum, their vows echoing in the sacred space. They were vows not of duty or alliance, but of a deep and abiding love, of two souls recognizing their other half. As Theron slid the wedding band onto her finger and declared her his wife and queen before the cheering crowd, Alara looked out at the sea of happy faces. Her family had sold her, deeming her worthless. But here, she had found a new family, a whole kingdom that cherished her. She had found a home. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony of their chambers, looking out at the moonlit valley, Theron wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he whispered into her hair. Alara leaned back against his solid warmth, placing her hand over his. She looked at her reflection in the crystal window. A woman with a constellation on her skin, a queen's crown on her head, and the love of a king in her eyes. She was no longer the girl defined by her flaw. She was a woman defined by her strength, her courage, and the love she had both given and received. The story told about her was no longer one of rejection. It was one of redemption, of transformation, of a love so powerful it could bring back the sun. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered, her heart full to bursting. He had paid everything for her at the auction, a price that had shocked the world. But what they had built together, what they had found in each other, was something truly priceless. It was a love that had healed a kingdom, vanquished a curse, and turned a broken girl into a radiant queen. It was, quite simply, everything. Wow, what an ending! If you loved Alara's story, please hit that like button and comment what part was your favorite. And subscribe for more amazing romance stories.